Madrid, 1834. The king was dead, yet inside the hushed marble corridors of the royal palace, your duties as physician were not over. You had tended favors, stitched wounds, and prepared remedies for the sovereign before, but nothing could prepare you for the task awaiting now. Queen Regent Maria Cristina, veiled in mourning, black stood before you. Her hands trembled, her face still streaked with tears. She did not speak at first. Instead, she only gestured toward the bed, where the lifeless body of Ferdinand VII lay, shrouded in heavy silk sheets. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the muffled tolling of church bells outside. When the Queen finally found her voice, her request chilled you to the marrow. You were not simply to preserve the king's remains. You were to preserve something more, something so grotesque, so infamous, that whispers about it had haunted the palace for decades. The object hidden beneath the silk was no crown, no relic of state, but a piece of anatomy, a secret so strange and obscene that it seemed to mock the very idea of kingship itself. Even in death, Ferdinand seemed to sneer at his subjects. Where the lifeless body of Ferdinand VII lay, shrouded in heavy silk sheets, the silence was unbearable, broken only by the muffled tolling of church bells outside. When the Queen finally found her voice, her request chilled you to the marrow. You were not simply to preserve the king's remains. You were to preserve something more, something so grotesque, so infamous, that whispers about it had haunted the palace for decades. The object hidden beneath the silk was no crown, no relic of state, but a piece of anatomy, a secret so strange and obscene that it seemed to mock the very idea of kingship itself. Even in death, Ferdinand seemed to sneer at his subjects. His reign had been a theater of cruelty, betrayal, and paranoia. And now his legacy revealed itself, not in words or deeds, but in flesh, the organ beneath the sheets, the monstrous misshapen symbol of both his deepest shame and his twisted pride. Your hand shook as you approached, scalpels gleaming in the dim candlelight. What lay before you was more than an autopsy. It was an act of preservation for history itself. A grotesque relic that embodied the very spirit of his reign. Oversized, deformed, destructive to everything it touched. You realized with horror that you were not merely preserving tissue. You were embalming the physical manifestation of a kingdom's suffering. Whispers of his condition had filled palace corridors for years. Stories of specially crafted cushions of screaming wives, of desperate and humiliating attempts to secure an heir. None of these tales had ever been spoken aloud. In official histories yet, every servant and diplomat who had brushed against the Spanish court knew the truth. The king's body was a secret, too large to be hidden and too shameful to be admitted. As you steadied your hands, your mind wandered back to the shadows of Ferdinand's life. He was more than a man. He was the child of a poisoned bloodline, born from centuries of royal inbreeding. That had already scarred Spain, with madness and deformity. His was a story of fate gone awry, of power corrupted by weakness and humiliation. And now, in this silent chamber, surrounded by the heavy scent of wax and decay, you felt the full weight of history pressing on you. This was not the end of your duty. It was only the beginning. To understand how Spain had arrived at this grim hour, you would have to peer backward, into the cursed cradle that had produced this king, into the chambers where shame and paranoia festered, into the dark machinery of a monarchy rotting from within. The sheets shifted as you pulled them back. The air seemed colder, as though the room itself recoiled. What you were about to preserve was not just flesh and blood. It was Spain's darkest inheritance, a grotesque secret that had shaped the course of an empire. And so, with trembling breath, you began to understand Ferdinand VII. You must return to his beginning, not to the chamber where he died, but to the cradle where he was first laid. For this king, more than most, was shaped by blood long before he was shaped by life. On October 14th, 7th, 84, within the vast halls of El Escorial Palace, the infant prince came crying into the world. But he was no innocent tabula rasa. He was already carrying centuries of genetic decay. His birth was the harvest of a royal orchard. Planted with rot, the Habsburgs of Spain had long been notorious for their inbreeding. For generations, cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and the family tree twisted inward upon itself, until it resembled more a circle than a lineage. The results were tragic, physical deformities. Weak jaws, infertility, and madness plagued the dynasty. When the Bourbon line inherited Spain, they were supposed to bring renewal, yet they too clung to the same habits, weaving the same poisonous knots in their family blood. Ferdinand's parents, King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, were themselves first cousins. Their marriage was not born of passion, but of dynastic strategy, a cold arithmetic of power, where family bloodlines mattered more than human vitality in the infant Ferdinand. That calculation bore its cruelest fruit. At first glance, he seemed a healthy child. Yet court physicians soon began to whisper. His growth was irregular, his proportions curious, his temperament volatile. By the time he reached adolescence, his physical development took a turn that defied medical comprehension. His most private anatomy, grotesquely large, twisted alien in shape, would haunt him for life. The royal court, a place where every detail was scrutinized and gossiped over, became a chamber of mockery. Foreign ambassadors scribbled notes about the Spanish. Embarrassment servants whispered behind their hands. Even priests and tutors struggled to conceal their unease when attending to the boy prince. He was born to inherit a throne. Yet from the start, he was marked as different, as deformed, not in mind alone, but in body itself, and here lies the irony. In an age when classical ideals of masculinity celebrated proportion and refinement, Ferdinand's monstrous endowment was not a symbol of virility, but of shame to the Greeks. Moderation was divine to the Spaniards of the late 18th century. This freakish growth was seen less as blessing than as curse. His future brides would recoil. His confidence would collapse, and his paranoia would grow, like a shadow over every aspect of his reign. Yet the curse was not only anatomical, it was also psychological. For how could a child growing under constant ridicule ever trust love, loyalty, or even faith itself? Every smile became suspicious. Every bow of respect seemed tinged with mockery. From his earliest years, Ferdinand carried not only the burden of kingship, but the suspicion that everyone around him was laughing. Spain too was already cracking, beneath the weight of its decaying empire. The Bourbon dynasty, in clinging to its insular traditions, had produced a king who embodied its decline. Ferdinand was not simply a man, he was a symptom. His blood, twisted by inbreeding, mirrored a monarchy, twisted by its own isolation and arrogance. The stage was set from the cradle onward. Ferdinand was destined to become both victim and tyrant, mocked in private, yet wielding absolute power in public. The anatomy that should have been hidden within silk and secrecy, instead became the hidden motor of his life. a deformity that would echo through Spain's history. The child born cursed by blood was now growing into a youth, destined to turn his shame into cruelty. And the world, though it did not yet know, would suffer for it. Ferdinand's childhood was less a royal upbringing than a lesson in humiliation. The palace into which he was born should have been a sanctuary of majesty. Instead, it was a theatre of dysfunction, where betrayal and weakness played out daily, before the young prince's eyes. His father, Charles de Croix, was a man ill-suited to rule. Gentle by nature, he cared more for hunting and tinkering with clocks than for governing an empire, while he retreated into hobbies. The affairs of the kingdom and of the royal bedchamber fell into other hands. Maria Luisa of Parma, Ferdinand's mother, was of a very different temperament, sharp, ambitious, and hungry for influence. She wielded more power than her husband. She was also notorious for her appetites, both political and personal. Her openly paraded affair with Manuel de Godoy, the Queen's lover and the kingdom's de facto ruler, was a scandal whispered across Europe. Imagine the young prince watching his father, humiliated daily, his mother flaunting her infidelity, and Godoy strutting through the palace corridors, with an authority greater than the king himself. This was Ferdinand's model of power, not dignity but betrayal, not authority but weakness. Yet even this public humiliation paled, compared to the private shame he endured. By adolescence, his physical abnormality had become impossible to ignore. Servants whispered as they dressed him. Tutors exchanged worried glances. Some dared to smirk foreign diplomats. Trained observers of courtly secrets wrote home about the Spanish embarrassment for a boy already surrounded by dysfunction. This was unbearable. The whispers cut him deeper than any sword. Imagine being told, "You are the heir to one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe yet," sensing that everyone who bows before you is also laughing behind your back. Ferdinand began to see ridicule everywhere, in the polite smiles of his tutors, in the whispers of servants, even in the stiff courtesy of foreign envoys. His paranoia was not entirely imagined. There were indeed jokes and rumors, but he inflated them into a storm. That clouded his every perception. One incident, recorded in the memoirs of a palace chaplain, reveals just how deeply this shame festered. A young page, unaware of the danger, once entered the prince's chamber at the wrong moment and caught a glimpse of the royal deformity, instead of dismissing the boy with embarrassment. Ferdinand had him flogged. His family was exiled from Madrid. The message was unmistakable. No one could glimpse the prince's shame and live without punishment. This mixture of ridicule and retaliation became the pattern of Ferdinand's character. The more he felt mocked, the more cruel he became. Servants who failed him in trivial tasks were dismissed with severity. Courtiers who crossed him found themselves suddenly ruined. He had discovered a dangerous tool, the power to turn private shame into public punishment. These humiliations shaped him more deeply than the formal lessons of his tutors. He learned not wisdom, but vengeance, not governance, but suspicion. For Ferdinand, every relationship became a calculation of loyalty and betrayal, and as he grew older, the line between paranoia and reality blurred. In a court as decadent and venomous as Madrid's, where gossip was currency, Ferdinand's paranoia often found fertile ground. But instead of making him cautious, it made him vindictive. The child mocked for his body was slowly becoming the man who would mock, terrorize and destroy an entire kingdom. His deformity was no longer just a physical fact. It had begun to metastasize into a worldview, a philosophy of cruelty disguised as kingship. By the time Ferdinand reached manhood, Spain was already beginning to see glimpses of the tyrant he would become behind the silks and ceremonies of the Bourbon court. A boy wounded by shame was sharpening his cruelty into a weapon. As Ferdinand grew into adolescence, whispers hardened into clinical records. His body was no longer merely the subject of palace gossip. It became the obsession of physicians sworn to secrecy, who documented what they witnessed in guarded language. Tucked away in files never meant for public eyes, Dr. Francisco Flores, one of the court physicians, left behind notes that survived only in private collections and archives. His words, though, veiled in medical formality, betrayed astonishment His Majesty's member. He wrote cautiously, "Presents a most unusual configuration, its base alarmingly narrow, its extremity of such circumference as to defy natural proportion." The physician measured a length that rivaled walking sticks, with a grotesque curvature and strange, almost tumorous, growths of tissue that seemed to serve no purpose. It was, in Flora's words, a construction of nature. That renders ordinary relations perilous. If not impossible, the implications were dire. Ferdinand, heir to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe, might never be capable of consummating a marriage in any ordinary sense, for a dynasty whose survival depended on heirs. This was no small medical curiosity. It was a crisis of state. In hushed chambers, deep within the palace, artisans were summoned not to fashion jewelry or crowns, but contraptions euphemistically called marital aids, cushions of peculiar shape, harnesses of silk and leather, ointments and supports, designed to mitigate the monstrous anatomy. The workshops of Madrid, usually tasked with outfitting the monarch for battle or ceremony, became laboratories for the most intimate of state. Secrets but physical contraptions alone could not solve the deeper torment. Ferdinand himself was obsessed. From his teenage years, he sought out alchemists, herbalists, and foreign doctors who promised miracle cures. He swallowed concoctions of powdered pearls, ground rhinoceros horn, exotic herbs, and even tinctures of mercury, believing they might normalize his body, or at least grant fertility. None succeeded. Each failure deepened his desperation, making him prey to charlatans and quacks, who whispered of potions drawn from ancient Eastern wisdom or elixirs blessed by saints' relics. There was a cruel irony in all this, in an age when classical ideals still lingered, when statues of Apollo and Hermes were admired for their proportion and restraint. Ferdinand's grotesque endowment made him not enviable, but abhorrent, in a courtly culture that prized refinement. He was a living violation of aesthetic order, where Greek thought saw virtue in balance. Ferdinand was imbalance incarnate. Excess turned monstrous. This had profound psychological effects. His deformity was not just a burden in the bedchamber. It was a constant specter in his mind. Every failure, every rejection, every whisper he overheard became evidence of a world conspiring against him. His paranoia found its roots here, in the cruel joke of his body. What was meant to be private became political, for a king's body was never his own. It belonged to the dynasty, the nation, the future. Ferdinand's condition was quite literally a national emergency hidden behind velvet curtains, thus even before he ascended the throne. Spain's fate was already entangled with this grotesque inheritance. Ferdinand was a man at war with his own flesh, and as history would soon reveal, he would make his kingdom bleed for that war. By the dawn of the 19th century, Ferdinand had reached marriageable age. For any crown prince, a wedding was not merely a personal affair, it was the cornerstone of dynastic survival. And so, in 1802, at the age of 17, Ferdinand was wed to his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. Maria Antonia was the daughter of King Ferdinand II of the Two Sicilies and Queen Maria Carolina. Herself, a sister to the ill-fated Marie Antoinette of France, bright, intelligent, and by many accounts genuinely hopeful. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with the wide-eyed dreams of a young bride, raised on the stories of courtly romance. She had heard her future husband, referred to by his supporters as El Deseado, the desired one. She imagined herself the heroine in a tale of dynastic glory. The wedding itself was magnificent, as befitted the union of two great royal houses. The Cathedral of Madrid resounded with music, nobles paraded in silks, and the streets overflowed with cheering crowds. The young couple, radiant in their finery, presented the image of promise. Spain rejoiced, for at last, it seemed the Bourbon dynasty might find renewal. But royal weddings end and wedding nights begin. That was where the illusion shattered. Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting were startled when Ferdinand's valet quietly approached them with unusual requests, special cushions, strange oils, and objects that seemed more surgical than ceremonial. They were told it was customary for royal couples. In truth, it was preparation for the king's anatomical nightmare. The young princess, sheltered and devout, had received only the vaguest education. In matters of the body, what she encountered in the royal chamber was not romance, but horror. Witnesses later described the moment. She first saw her husband disrobed. She screamed uncontrollably, shrieking, "Monstro, monstro, monster," and pressed herself against the wall in hysterics. The sight of Ferdinand's grotesque endowment, club-like and twisted, broke her composure entirely. What followed was not a wedding night, but a medical procedure. Court physicians, already familiar with Ferdinand's condition, were summoned to assist. The specially crafted cushions were arranged, oils applied, and Marie Antoinette was dosed with laudanum, opium tincture to dull her terror. Even so, the act was brutal. For Ferdinand, humiliation mingled with rage. For Marie Antoinette, trauma etched itself into her very being over the following months. What should have been tender intimacy became ritualized ordeal. Each attempt at conception followed the same grim pattern. Preparations of oils and cushions, doctors on hand to monitor laudanum, administered until the young queen floated in haze. And then Ferdinand, forcing himself upon her with the aid of contraptions, designed more for restraint than romance. The process left Maria Antonia in tears, shaking and sickened, while Ferdinand stormed away in frustration. The court noticed servants whispered of muffled screams behind closed doors. Nobles gossiped about the queen's pale face and hollow eyes. Rumors spread of the elaborate apparatuses carried discreetly into the royal bedchamber. What should have been a marriage, celebrated as a dynastic alliance, soon became a spectacle of whispered pity. Marie Antoinette, still barely a woman, began to depend increasingly on laudanum to endure her duties. What started as drops to calm her nerves turned into escalating doses that numbed both body and mind. She would retreat into dreams, dull to the brutal reality of her marriage. Ferdinand, meanwhile, sank deeper into paranoia. He sensed her revulsion and it enraged him. Instead of compassion, he interpreted it as insult. Instead of tenderness, he doubled down on cruelty. The humiliation of his condition festered, like an untreated wound, poisoning his relationship with the very woman upon whom the dynasty depended. The first marriage of Ferdinand VII, which had begun with ceremony and hope, had already become a nightmare, a union defined not by love, but by medical contraptions, opium and despair. Spain had gained not a queen, but a victim, and the echoes of her suffering would soon reach every corner of the kingdom. For a queen, duty was not measured in affection or happiness, but in heirs, and for Maria Antonia that duty quickly became a waking nightmare. Every month brought new rituals in the royal chamber, each more desperate than the last. Physicians whispered instructions. As if conducting a medical experiment, cushions were positioned, restraints adjusted, oils applied with clinical detachment. Maria Antonia would be given her dose of laudanum, until her eyes glazed and her body slackened. Then Ferdinand, consumed with shame and rage, would force through the motions of what should have been the most intimate of acts. The court called these efforts of dynastic duty. In reality, they were ordeals of pain and humiliation. Maria Antonia learned to endure them, with silent prayers, clutching rosaries even as her body convulsed with fear. Ferdinand, meanwhile, grew increasingly obsessed with the idea that nature itself was conspiring against him. When medicine failed, he turned to superstition. Astrologers were summoned to chart the stars, dictating when the couple must attempt conception. Mystics were brought in from distant lands. One, a self-proclaimed Oriental sage, convinced Ferdinand that his twisted anatomy was a dragon's rod, a divine sign that required exotic rituals. For 3 months, the royal couple enjoyed incense, chanting, and bizarre positions dictated by the so-called master. Miraculously, Marie Antoinette did. Conceived twice, the court erupted in celebration. At last the Bourbon line might be secured. Bells rang and prayers were offered across Madrid. But both pregnancies ended in tragedy. The first, in 1804, ended in miscarriage within the 4th month. Physicians spoke in vague terms about the Queen's delicate constitution, but in private letters they admitted the truth. The violence and trauma of her marital ordeals had wrecked her body. The second, in 1805, was crueler still. Maria Antonia carried nearly to term, only to suffer a harrowing labor. That ended in the stillbirth of her child. The Queen herself nearly died. She never fully recovered physically or mentally. After these losses, Maria Antonia descended further into laudanum's embrace. What began as an opiate for pain became her escape from reality. She drifted through the palace like a ghost, her once bright eyes dulled, her laughter gone. Courtiers whispered of her wasting figure, her trembling hands, her increasingly erratic prayers for forgiveness, for sins she could not name. Ferdinand, instead of compassion, responded with suspicion. He accused her of deliberately sabotaging pregnancies, of harboring liberal sympathies. That made her unfit to bear a true Catholic heir. He had her correspondence watched, her servants replaced her movements monitored. The Queen, who had once arrived full of youthful hope, was now treated as both a failure and a traitor. By May 1807, Marie Antoinette was dead. Just 21 years old, the official cause was fever, but those close to her knew otherwise. She had died from despair, her body consumed by trauma and opium. Some whispered that Ferdinand himself had hastened her death. That poison had been slipped into her medicines. The sudden death of the royal apothecary shortly afterward, found lifeless in his chamber with a cryptic note. Seized and destroyed by Ferdinand's agents, only fueled the suspicions. Maria Antonia's death marked more than the end of a marriage. It was the first great crack in the image of Ferdinand, as El Deseado, behind the curtains of royal ceremony. Spain had seen the making of a tyrant. The young king in waiting had turned his wife into a victim, his bed into a torture chamber, and his quest for an heir into a theatre of cruelty. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette was not hers alone. It was a forewarning, a glimpse, of the devastation Ferdinand's paranoia and deformity would unleash upon everyone bound to him, from his wives to his kingdom. Maria Antonia's death should have humbled Ferdinand, should have forced him into reflection. Instead, it hardened him. The young widower, barely into his 20s, carried forward not grief, but resentment he had buried a wife, who had never been more than a vessel for his paranoia. And in that burial, something darker in him took root. Palace life after 1800. Seven bore witness to his transformation. Ferdinand, already marked by suspicion, grew sharper in cruelty. Servants learned that a misplaced word or a glance at the wrong moment could ruin them. Some were dismissed and cast into poverty. Others simply vanished, exiled or imprisoned on obscure charges. The prince once mocked now discovered the power of fear. What had begun as humiliation was becoming sadism. He began to cultivate a small circle of loyalists, nobles and officers who saw in him not deformity, but opportunity. They whispered that Ferdinand was destined to save Spain from the corruption of Charles IV and his hated favorite, Manuel de Godoy. This circle called themselves the Fernandinos. They crafted an image of the prince as El Deseado, the desired one, a beacon of patriotism, who would restore Spain's dignity. But the truth behind this mask was uglier. Ferdinand was neither reformer nor patriot. He was a young man consumed by envy and resentment, who interpreted loyalty as flattery and opposition as treason. To him, power was not a responsibility, but a shield against mockery, a way to strike back at those who laughed. The test came in October 18th, 07, with the so-called El Escorial conspiracy. Ferdinand, with his Fernandinos, plotted to overthrow his father and Godoy, with the backing of Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a dangerous game, played with the naivety of a man who mistook his own desperation for political genius. The plot unraveled quickly. When discovered, Ferdinand revealed his true nature, not as bold conspirator, but as coward. Faced with exposure, he betrayed everyone. He confessed in detail, named allies and begged his parents for forgiveness, while his supporters faced imprisonment and exile. Ferdinand saved himself by offering their heads. This moment defined him. It showed Spain, and perhaps Ferdinand himself, what kind of ruler he would become. Not a bold conspirator, but a coward. A man who used others and discarded them. The instant danger loomed. Meanwhile, his private torment deepened. Physicians noted that his deformity seemed to worsen with age, growing in both size and grotesque irregularity. Some modern historians speculate he suffered from a rare hormonal disorder, megalophallus, that caused continual growth into adulthood. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Ferdinand's condition was not stabilizing. It was becoming even more monstrous. This only fed his paranoia. He became obsessed with secrecy, convinced that foreign courts mocked him in private. When he received letters, he imagined hidden laughter between the lines, even his allies among the Fernandinos. were not immune to his suspicions. He maintained lists of names, people he suspected of gossiping about his shame, waiting for the day when power would allow him revenge. By 1807, Spain's empire was cracking, and its prince was already fractured. Those who placed their hopes in Ferdinand mistook cruelty for strength, paranoia for patriotism. They could not yet see that the seeds they had watered would grow into a reign, more disastrous than any they hoped to replace. The boy mocked for his deformity had become a man, determined to make the world suffer for it, and Spain, still unaware of the storm about to break, awaited his ascension with naive hope. In 1808, the storm broke. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe, turned his gaze to Spain. What he saw was a crumbling monarchy, a weak king, a despised minister, and a crowned prince entangled in conspiracies. It was the perfect moment to strike. The Spanish Bourbons collapsed under the weight of their own dysfunction. Charles IV abdicated under pressure. Ferdinand briefly proclaimed himself king, and then humiliated beyond repair. Both father and son were summoned to Bayonne, where Napoleon forced them to surrender their crowns. Spain, an empire that had once stretched across oceans, now lay in the hands of a foreign conqueror. Ferdinand, stripped of power, was carried off to gilded captivity in France, at the Château de Valence. He would spend 6 long years as Napoleon's prisoner. Yet this was no ordinary imprisonment. For the French, the Spanish king was not just a political tool. He was a medical curiosity. French physicians, freed from the suffocating etiquette that had constrained their Spanish counterparts, examined him with clinical precision. What they recorded was shocking, even by their standards. Reports discovered decades later in Napoleonic archives describe an organ so vast in length and girth, with irregular curvatures and growths, as to resemble not the appendage of a man, but the distorted relic of myth. To them, he was less a monarch than a case study. A perfect storm, they wrote, of hereditary corruption manifesting in anatomy. For Ferdinand, this was torture of a different kind. The French doctors had no need to flatter him. They dissected his condition with cold detachment. What in Madrid had been hidden behind silks and euphemisms was here exposed under bright light and inked into medical records. A king's most intimate shame became the subject of scientific sketches passed around lecture halls in Paris. Meanwhile, Spain bled. Guerrillas rose against Napoleon. Priests turned pulpits into battlefields, and whole villages were burned in reprisals. Brave men and women fought and died for the restoration of Ferdinand, the so-called deseado to them. He was the rightful monarch, the living symbol of resistance against French occupation. But in Valence, Ferdinand was not planning Spain's liberation. He was planning his next marriage. Letters preserved from this period show his obsession, not with the war, but with his own dynastic anxieties. He wrote to courts across Europe, inquiring after princesses who might accept his special circumstances. His words reveal a man consumed not by patriotism, but by his anatomy, begging foreign royals for understanding, for solutions for brides, who would endure what Maria Antonia could not. Spain's patriots shed blood in mountains and villages, crying his name. Ferdinand, in captivity, thought not of them, but of heirs. And yet, when the tide turned against Napoleon, when Spain clawed back its independence through sacrifice and fire, the nation still longed for his return. To them, Ferdinand was the lost king, the symbol of legitimacy. When the French finally released him in 1814, his journey back across the Pyrenees became a pilgrimage. Villages lined the roads, Crowds wept with joy. Children were lifted high to see him pass. Flowers rained upon his carriage. The people believed their saviour had returned. But the Ferdinand who came home was not a saviour. He was a man shaped by humiliation, sharpened by paranoia, and obsessed beyond measure with his deformity. The King Spain, welcomed with tears of joy, was the same man who had betrayed allies, tortured wives, and spent his captivity, writing letters about his anatomy. The irony was profound, while Spain had fought for freedom. Ferdinand had prepared only to enslave them again, to his whims, to his fears, and to his body's grotesque shadow. In 1814, Ferdinand crossed back into Spain. What awaited him was nothing short of adoration. Cities rang with bells. Peasants threw themselves to the ground in tears. Nobles kissed his hands with trembling devotion. After 6 years of war, after villages burned and families torn apart, the people wanted to believe in salvation. To them, Ferdinand was not a flawed man. They imagined him as Spain reborn. El Deseado had returned, but behind the ceremonial smiles, Ferdinand's thoughts were elsewhere. He was not thinking of the Constitution of 1812, drafted by Spanish liberals, who had risked their lives in the war. He was not thinking of reform, nor of gratitude for his people's sacrifices. His mind was already turning back to his private obsessionaires. His first actions as restored monarch revealed his true nature, the ink of his signature, annulled the liberal constitution, crushed the hopes of reformers, and restored the heavy hand of absolutism. The cheering crowds who had welcomed him home soon found their freedoms extinguished. Ferdinand had returned not as saviour, but as tyrant and in his private chambers. The obsession with his body took centre stage once more. He immediately commissioned a new generation of marital devices, reaching far beyond Spain. Agents were dispatched across Europe, to German workshops, famed for their precision mechanics, to Italian artisans skilled in silks and leathers, even to the Ottoman Empire, where whispers told of specialists in delicate, royal circumstances. What they brought back was a grotesque collection of contraptions, pillows shaped with bizarre curves, harnesses of steel and silk, instruments that resembled surgical tools more than aids to intimacy. The palace workshops, hidden in the bowels of Madrid, became a fusion of laboratory and torture chamber. Craftsmen who once forged swords for war now bent their skill towards shaping devices. For the king's bed, the secrecy was suffocating. Artisans were sworn to silence, some who worked too closely on the royal project later disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The shadow of Ferdinand's paranoia ensured no whisper of these devices. Left the palace walls, meanwhile, the Spain outside those walls was collapsing. The war against Napoleon had drained the treasury. Revolt simmered in the American colonies, threatening to strip Spain of its empire roads. Lay in ruins, peasants starved, and cities cried out for relief. But Ferdinand's attention was fixed elsewhere, on the silks of his chamber, on the impossible duty of producing an heir, on the humiliations of his anatomy. Historians would later call this era La Década Ominosa, the ominous decade. Yet the ominousness was not only political, it was personal. The dysfunction of the king's body had fused with the dysfunction of his reign. Each failure in the royal bed echoed in his governance. Each paranoia about mockery in his chamber fueled purges and persecutions in his kingdom. To the public, Ferdinand presented the image of majesty, robed in gold hand, raised in solemn blessing, a monarch restored by divine providence. But within the palace, in hidden rooms, were devices of leather and steel, gleamed under candlelight. The truth was darker. The kingdom's future depended on an anatomy that defied nature itself, and on a man who had long ceased to separate his private shame from the fate of his nation. The ominous decade had begun, and Spain, still kneeling in gratitude for their restored king, would soon learn the price of that devotion. By 1816, Ferdinand had secured a second wife. Her name was Maria Isabel of Portugal, another cousin proof that the Bourbon dynasty had learned nothing from the genetic disasters of its past. She was only 19 when she arrived in Madrid, hopeful, innocent, and wholly unprepared for the fate awaiting her. The marriage ceremony was dazzling. As always, gold investments, trumpets, incense rising through cathedral arches. The illusion of royal splendor, masking the desperation beneath. For Ferdinand, this was not love. It was another attempt to cheat fate, to produce the heir that had eluded him, through Maria Antonia's suffering. On the wedding night, that desperation transformed into horror. Despite months of preparation, special devices crafted in secret, physicians on standby, even whispered consultations with foreign experts, the reality could not be disguised. As the chamber doors closed, what followed was not romance, but violence. Servants waiting outside heard screams so piercing, they rushed forward only to be turned away. The next morning, blood-stained sheets and shattered furniture revealed the truth. The king's grotesque condition had turned a wedding into a nightmare. Maria Isabel was never the same. Court observers noted how quickly her spirit broke. Once lively and hopeful, she developed a stutter and a nervous tremor. She would flinch whenever Ferdinand entered a room, her body recoiling as though from a predator. Her ladies whispered of night terrors, screams that echoed through the palace corridors, as she relived the horrors of that first night. But Ferdinand interpreted her terror not as trauma, but as insult to him. Her revulsion was mockery. His paranoia swelled. He began to suspect her of conspiring with foreign powers to humiliate him, of writing letters that ridiculed his condition, of plotting against him in secret. Her meals were tasted for poison, her correspondence intercepted, her chambers searched. The palace became less a home and more a prison, with the young queen at its center. And still, the pressure to produce an heir weighed heavily. Physicians were summoned, devices redesigned, schedules dictated by astrologers and court alchemists. Ferdinand even allowed foreign experts to witness his attempts, a grotesque transformation of his marital bed into a medical theatre. German anatomists, French doctors, and Italian specialists took notes, their sketches of the king's anatomy, quietly circulating through Europe's medical schools. Ferdinand had become less a monarch than a specimen. His shame, meant to be hidden, was now studied by strangers under the guise of science. For Maria Isabel, the degradation was unbearable. She stopped eating, grew dangerously thin, and drifted into a hollow-eyed silence. That unnerved her attendants. Palace physicians diagnosed her with hysteria, the fashionable word for a mind crushed by suffering. In truth, she was a young woman trapped in a nightmare. She could neither endure nor escape. The consequences stretched beyond the bedchamber. Across the Atlantic, Spain's American colonies rose in revolt. Revolutionary pamphlets depicted Ferdinand as both tyrant and impotent, a man whose personal deformity mirrored the corruption of his reign. They mocked him as incapable of producing heirs, incapable of ruling, incapable even of being a man. His most intimate shame had become propaganda for independence. In Madrid, meanwhile, Ferdinand responded with fury. He revived the Inquisition, unleashed purges against anyone who whispered disloyalty, and filled prisons with supposed traitors. He created a climate of fear, where even private jokes could mean exile or death. The laughter that had haunted him as a boy had now become a crime against the crown. For Maria Isabel, there was no laughter left, only silence, exhaustion, and fear. 2 years after her wedding in 1880, she died at the age of 21. The official cause was nervous exhaustion, but her ladies knew the truth. She had wasted away, consumed by terror and despair. Some whispered that she had welcomed death as her only escape. Ferdinand's response was chilling. He wept in public, but in private, he raged at imagined conspiracies, ordering autopsies and arrests of her attendants. He could not accept that his own body, his own cruelty, had destroyed her. To him, Maria Isabel's death was just another betrayal. Another wife had been buried, another chance at heirs extinguished, and Ferdinand's, more paranoid than ever, turned his eyes once again toward marriage, not for love, not for companionship, but for a womb that might somehow endure what 2 others had not. By the late 18th, Spain was collapsing, and Ferdinand's second wife lay in her grave. The king sank deeper into paranoia and tyranny. His reign became a grotesque mirror of his private torment, insecure, suspicious, and destructive. The loss of Spain's American colonies was the great tragedy of this era. In Mexico, Bolivar's northern allies rallied peasants and criollos alike under banners of independence. In Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Peru, everywhere revolution burned. These colonies had sustained Spain for 3 centuries, flooding Madrid with silver, sugar, and gold now. One by one they broke away. The Bourbon dynasty's empire was disintegrating, and what was Ferdinand doing as his empire slipped away? He was tightening the screws of repression at home. To him, every lost colony was not a failure of policy, but the result of conspiracy. Liberals, Freemasons, intellectuals, they became his scapegoats. He unleashed the restored Inquisition, not to defend faith, but to silence whispers about his rule and his shame. Ordinary citizens found themselves investigated for casual remarks at taverns, or for private letters intercepted by spies. In this Spain, a joke about the king's deformity could carry the same weight as treason inside the palace. Ferdinand's paranoia took absurd forms. He ordered secret passages built so he could move unseen between chambers, mirrors placed to catch reflections of would-be eavesdroppers, and an ever-rotating guard so that no single group could conspire. His household lived in constant dread. A misplaced smile, a servant lingering too long near a door, even a sigh in the Queen's chamber could trigger suspicion. Maria Isabel's death only deepened the gloom. Court physicians noted bizarre episodes in which Ferdinand convinced himself she had been pregnant, her supposed. Phantom pregnancies were treated with ceremony, servants whispering prayers, Ferdinand pacing with manic anticipation, only to collapse into despair when reality shattered the illusion. Each phantom heir was both a hope and a humiliation, further unhinging the king. The wider world saw the truth more clearly than Ferdinand's court dared admit. Revolutionary pamphlets across the Americas depicted him as both tyrant and mockery, a king incapable of producing an heir, incapable of defending his empire, incapable of being a man, the deformity of his body. One Mexican satirist wrote, "Is the deformity of his reign. Spain's weakness abroad was explained by the grotesque rumors of its monarch." At home, Ferdinand answered with brutality. He unleashed waves of purges, imprisoning liberal deputies, silencing newspapers, and exiling intellectuals. In his mind, Spain's troubles had nothing to do with poverty, corruption, or misrule. They were conspiracies. Always conspiracies, plots against him, whispers against his manhood, laughter against his dignity. But repression could not halt reality. The Americas were gone, Spain's power was shriveling, to the size of the peninsula itself. And within those shrinking borders, Ferdinand's tyranny was breeding only bitterness and fear. He had already buried 2 wives, both broken by his monstrous body and his cruelty. His empire was burning away. And still Ferdinand convinced himself. The solution lay not in reform, not in compassion, but in yet another marriage, another attempt, another womb to sacrifice to the curse of his dynasty. In 1819, Ferdinand took yet another bride, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. She was 24, older than his previous wives, and came from a court desperate for alliance. The Saxons, crippled by Napoleon's wars, accepted what others had refused: marriage to the notorious Spanish king, whose previous queens had died young and childless. Maria Josepha was different from Marie, Antoinette, and Isabel. She had been carefully prepared for what awaited her. Saxon physicians, aware of Ferdinand's condition, had briefed her attendants in medical terms, sparing her the naive shock that had broken her predecessors. She even brought with her a personal physician and a collection of her own instruments, devices designed for what the marriage contract coyly called delicate circumstances. The wedding in Madrid lacked the splendor of Ferdinand's earlier unions. The court was weary of funerals, weary of mourning, black trailing through palace corridors. Still, the marriage was celebrated with cautious hope. Perhaps this older, more pragmatic queen could succeed, where others had failed. But for Maria Josepha, the royal bedchamber was no less a prison. Unlike Isabel, who had been terrified, or Maria Antonia, who had been horrified, Maria Josepha approached her marital duties like a clinical trial. She kept records, times, positions, treatments applied each attempt at conception, noted with the detached precision of a physician. To her, intimacy was not romance, it was a medical procedure, to be endured in the service of dynastic duty. Yet Ferdinand's paranoia twisted even this detachment into insult. He grew convinced that his wife viewed him not as a husband, but as a specimen, that her records were not for medical aid, but for espionage. He imagined her correspondence with Saxon doctors as coded reports to foreign courts, mocking his anatomy across Europe. In truth, Maria Josepha's notes were desperate attempts to find a method, any method to endure what seemed impossible. But Ferdinand, ever suspicious, saw betrayal in every line of ink, while the royal bedchamber turned into a laboratory of failed experiments. Spain itself unraveled across the Atlantic. One colony after another declared independence. By the early 1820s, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, all were gone. The rivers of silver that had once sustained Madrid ran dry. The Spanish Empire, once the largest in the world, had crumbled, and yet Ferdinand was unmoved. Cabinet meetings were postponed, while he sulked over failed attempts in the bedroom. Diplomatic envoys cooled their heels as the king raged about his wife's supposed mockery. Spain's fall was accelerated by a ruler who could not see beyond his own shame. Maria Josepha endured this nightmare for a decade. She wasted away physically, her body pale and frail. But she maintained her careful records, as though science could solve what nature had cursed. For Ferdinand, each failure was another wound to his pride. His cruelty deepened. He railed against her coldness, accused her of conspiracies, and treated her with the same suspicion. He showed his ministers, and yet, in 1829, something happened that shocked the court. Spain and Europe alike, Maria Josefa became pregnant. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Perhaps after all these years, the Bourbon line would have an heir. Bells rang in Madrid, courtiers whispered of miracles, and Ferdinand's paranoia turned into manic euphoria. But fate was not finished with him. The pregnancy of Maria Josefa in 1829 was hailed as a miracle after a decade of sterile torment. Spain finally glimpsed the possibility of an heir. Ferdinand, euphoric, ordered masses of thanksgiving across the kingdom. Priests proclaimed divine providence, nobles prepared elaborate gifts, and courtiers jostled for favor with the queen, they now called the hope of Spain. But beneath the pageantry, fear lurked. Everyone in the palace knew the truth. Ferdinand's condition had made conception nearly impossible. Whispers spread, was the child even his? Did Maria Josefa turn in desperation to another man? Some saw the pregnancy as proof of infidelity, others as divine intervention. For Ferdinand, there could be no doubts. He clung to the belief that this was his triumph, his vindication against all who had mocked him. His paranoia, however, poisoned even this fragile hope. He increased the guards around the queen, convinced assassins would seek to end her pregnancy. He summoned not only physicians, but astrologers, priests, and alchemists, demanding protections, both spiritual and medical. Maria Josefa's chambers became a bizarre crossroads of science and superstition. Holy water sprinkled beside surgical instruments, relics laid next to forceps, candles burning alongside tinctures and tonics. For several months, it seemed Spain might finally celebrate a royal birth. But in the 7th month, Maria Josefa began to bleed. Physicians recognized the signs of placental abruption, a condition poorly understood at the time, but deadly even today. The solution should have been rest, careful monitoring, and quiet instead. Ferdinand's meddling created chaos. He insisted on consulting mystics, demanded conflicting treatments, and overruled doctors with his own. Half-learned theories on May 18th at 8:09. Maria Josefa went into premature labor. The delivery was catastrophic, Ferdinand refusing to leave her side. Barked orders, while physicians struggled against nature's cruelty. The child, a daughter, was born alive but frail, her tiny cries lasting only a few hours, before fading into silence. Maria Josefa survived the birth, but was shattered both in body and spirit. For 3 weeks, she lingered in weakness, racked with fever and infection. Ferdinand, unable to face the truth, forced physicians to continue treatments, some so invasive they only worsened her suffering. He ordered prayers, blessings, and even rituals whispered by charlatans, who promised divine healing. None availed. On June 10th, Maria Josefa died aged only 25. The king's reaction was grotesque. He refused to allow her body, or the child's, to be buried. He demanded physicians continue attempting revival, pacing the chambers, as the stench of decay filled the palace. For nearly a week, he lingered among the corpses, issuing orders, as though death could be commanded into submission. When at last he accepted their loss, his grief curdled into paranoia. He accused doctors of negligence, courtiers of conspiracy, and even priests of filing in their prayers. He wept in public, but raged in private, seeing betrayal in every face around him. The miracle had become tragedy, and with it, Ferdinand slipped. Further into madness, 3 wives had died in his bed. 3 queens had been consumed by his deformity. his cruelty and his obsession. Spain, meanwhile, had lost not only its colonies, but its last fragile hope of stability. The Bourbon line teetered on the edge of extinction. But Ferdinand's story did not end in despair, for even as Maria Josefa was lowered into the earth, another marriage was already being arranged, one that would entangle Spain in deception, paranoia, and the birth of a child, whose paternity would haunt the dynasty forever. Barely months after Maria Josefa's funeral, Ferdinand was preparing for yet another marriage. Spain was collapsing, its colonies gone, its treasury empty, its people restless. But the king's obsession with producing an heir eclipsed every other concern. In September 1829, at the age of 45, he wed Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily. Niece of his first wife, Maria Cristina, was 23, intelligent and politically shrewd, but she arrived in Madrid carrying a secret. She was already pregnant when she married Ferdinand. The king, desperate and deluded, accepted the fiction that the child was his. To him, legitimacy mattered more than truth. And so, when Isabella II was born in 1830, Ferdinand declared her his daughter, the heir of Spain, though many in Europe whispered otherwise. The charade gave Ferdinand a fragile sense of victory, but it also deepened his paranoia. If Isabella's legitimacy were questioned, his dynasty would unravel. Thus began the most grotesque period of surveillance. In the Spanish court, Ferdinand, already suspicious of everyone, now turned his obsession upon Maria Cristina. He prowled her chambers at night, sometimes bursting in with guards, demanding to know what she was doing. He had peepholes drilled into walls, so he could watch her unseen, his eye glinting like a predator's through the cracks. While she prayed or nursed her child, servants whispered of the Queen, moving about her rooms with the composure of an actress, careful not to show emotion, knowing her every gesture was watched. Meals became ceremonies of paranoia. Ferdinand demanded tasters sample every dish, then wait half an hour to prove no poison lingered. The king stared at them the entire time, scrutinizing every twitch of the face, every swallow, as though death itself might reveal treachery. Some taste is fainted under the strain, which only confirmed his suspicions. Maria Cristina bore this glass cage existence, with outward serenity but privately crumbled, in secret letters to her family, later discovered in archives. She wrote of living in a house where even my breath is counted. She confessed she felt like a prisoner, trapped in a role she could not abandon, compelled to smile before courtiers, while her soul withered in private. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's paranoia infected the entire machinery of government. Cabinet meetings were spectacles of suspicion. He deliberately contradicted himself to test ministers' loyalty, interpreting correction as treason. Guards were rotated daily, advisors interrogated over rumors, and courtiers whispered in coded language. To avoid being overheard, the once great Spanish court had degenerated into a madhouse of surveillance and fear yet. Ferdinand's obsession with heirs did not end with Isabella's birth. Despite his age and declining health, he continued to force conjugal attempts with Maria Cristina, hoping for a son to solidify the succession. These ordeals, like those of his previous wives, left the Queen traumatized. Physicians, alchemists, and astrologers still hovered at the edges of the royal bed, their presence reducing marriage to ritual and experiment. For Ferdinand, love was impossible. Every embrace was surveillance, every kiss suspicion, every child a question. Mark, his dynasty's survival rested on a daughter he could not bring himself to fully believe was his. and a wife he trusted less with each passing day. The king, who had once been mocked as a boy, was now a man who mocked his entire nation, twisting his shame into tyranny. But time was running out. His body, already warped by its grotesque burden, was breaking under the weight of age, paranoia, and disease. The end was approaching, and with it, the final, macabre revelation of the man Spain had once called El Deseado by 1833. Ferdinand's body was failing. The years of paranoia, opiates, and unrelenting stress had left him trembling, bloated, and nearly incoherent. Court physicians recorded nervous agitation, digestive collapse, and signs of cognitive decline. At public appearances, he rambled, muttered about conspiracies, and sometimes forgot his own decrees to the people. The once celebrated DC Iota now looked like a shadow of a man. In September of that year, Ferdinand slipped into a slow death. Officially, it was blamed on gout, a noble disease befitting a king, but those closest to him knew better. He was dying of exhaustion, not only of the body, but of the spirit. For decades, he had been consumed by war with himself, fighting against his own flesh, against laughter, against the specter of failure. That war had hollowed him, until nothing remained but suspicion and misery. He died on September 29th. A tocsin 33 bells tolled across Madrid. Courtiers wept, priests declared that the king had entered the arms of God. Yet within the palace, the atmosphere was one of grim relief. Ferdinand was gone, and with him, the suffocating climate of terror that had haunted every corridor. But his death brought no peace. His autopsy, conducted in secrecy by the same physicians who had spent decades trying to manage his deformity, revealed the full horror. His organ, preserved for study, measured over 14 inches in length, grotesquely disproportionate, narrow at its base, and swollen monstrously at its tip. Internal scarring showed repeated, self-inflicted attempts at correction, as though the king had tried to reshape his body with crude instruments. These failed surgeries had left him mutilated, trapped in ever deeper dysfunction. The organ, sealed away in the Vatican archives, became a relic of silence, too obscene to display, too politically dangerous to acknowledge. Scholars who glimpsed the records centuries later described them as a window into the private hell of a king who could not escape himself. And yet Ferdinand's deformity was only the beginning of his legacy. Spain emerged from his reign shattered, its American empire gone, its treasury empty, its people weary of tyranny. His daughter Isabella II, whose paternity remained an open question, would inherit not stability, but civil war. The Carlist Wars erupted almost immediately, plunging Spain into decades of bloodshed. Ferdinand VII had left his nation, as he had left his wives, broken, mistrustful, and traumatized. His personal shame had metastasized into national catastrophe. What began as a boy mocked for his deformity had ended as a monarch who mocked the hopes of his people. Perhaps most tragically, Ferdinand's story illustrates the danger of monarchy itself, where the fate of millions can be bound to the private nightmares of one man. His deformity was not just flesh, it was policy. His paranoia was not just personal, it became law. His cruelty was not just confined to the bedchamber, it echoed through prisons, inquisitions, and battlefields. As the royal physician stood over his corpse in 1834, preserving the grotesque relic that symbolized his reign, the irony must have been overwhelming. Spain's most intimate disaster had been embalmed in flesh, the monstrous secret beneath the silk sheets, was not just a medical curiosity. It was the mirror of a kingdom deformed by power, secrecy, and shame. Ferdinand achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind he craved. His name endures not as a savior or builder, but as a warning that, when power falls into the hands of the broken, private torment can become public ruin. The king, who had been called El Deseado, the desired one, left Spain with nothing but scars. The king was dead, but the story was not over. His death had thrown the nation into chaos. He had left no male heir, only a daughter whose legitimacy was openly questioned. As the bells tolled, the palace was already preparing for a civil war. The Carlist Wars would be the final bloody legacy of his reign. His cruelty had not died with him. It was now a war for the future of Spain. Ferdinand's deformity, the source of his endless paranoia, was not just a medical fact. It was a political curse. It had driven him to marry 4 times. It had caused the deaths of 3 queens. And it had left a kingdom without a clear successor. The physical manifestation of his shame had become the very political instability that would consume Spain. It was a perfect, terrible irony. The civil war, which would rage for decades, was fought over a simple question. Was Isabella a legitimate heir? Her uncle Don Carlos, a brother of the late king, claimed the throne. He argued that Isabella's birth was a fabrication, a lie to secure a fragile succession. The war was not about power alone. It was a war over a king's private shame. The whispers of the royal bedchamber had become the cries of battlefields. Don Carlos and his followers, known as the Carlists, were the defenders of tradition. They clung to the ancient law that no woman could inherit the Spanish throne. But in truth, they were fighting for something more, for a man who represented the old ways, a man of God who would restore the monarchy to its unblemished purity. The Carlists saw the king's deformity as a sign of divine punishment. They believed that the birth of Isabella was a lie, a trick of the devil to corrupt the kingdom. On the other side, Maria Cristina, as queen regent, fought for her daughter's right to the throne. To secure her position, she allied herself with the liberals, the very people her husband had persecuted for years. The war became a clash between 2 visions for Spain, one of rigid tradition and the other of reform. But at its heart, it was a war over a secret, a whispered story of a king's monstrous body. The nation was tearing itself apart over an anatomical impossibility. The war raged for 7 years, leaving a trail of death and devastation across the country. Brother fought brother, neighbor fought neighbor. Isabella II, the child at the center of the conflict, grew up in the shadow of this brutal inheritance. She would eventually take the throne, but the question of her legitimacy would always linger. Her reign would be plagued by instability, and she would eventually be deposed in a revolution. The Spanish monarchy would endure, but it would never fully recover. It was a dynasty haunted by its own past, by the ghosts of its inbred kings and their broken queens. Ferdinand's story had come full circle. It began with a boy who was a victim of his body, and it ended with a nation that was a victim of his reign. His personal tragedy had become Spain's national catastrophe. The king who had been called El Deseado, the desired one, had left nothing but scars.